The banker set the appraisal sheet on the desk and turned it so Clara Voss could read it right side up. 92 acres, rough pasture, fair fence on the east and south, poor everywhere else. Then the line that mattered, no well of record, no pond, no independent water source. Clara had already read it twice in the truck before she came in. Roy Delacroix ran loans at the farmers and merchants branch in town, and he had known Clara's father for 30 years before he'd known Clara at all. He wasn't unkind about it. He just laid the paper flat and tapped it once with 2 fingers. "Clara, I can't carry pasture that can't water stock," he said. "Not at full value, not on this renewal." "There's a spring on the north line," Clara said. "Runs into a stone trough, has for years." Roy pulled the plat book closer and traced the boundary with his pen. "Not on your side of the fence." Clara didn't answer that right away. "Then it isn't your water," Roy said. He didn't say it to be hard. He said it the way a man states a fact he has stated before, to other people, in the same office, about other farms. The collateral value has to reflect what's actually yours. "I'm sorry, I am." She left the bank with the loan renewal still open and the interest clock still running, and she drove home along the gravel with the radio off, thinking about that word, yours, the way it had landed flat and final across the desk. The bank was right about the fence. It would take her the better part of a month to find out it was wrong about the deed. This is the story of how Clara Voss, 39 years old, farming 92 acres in the Missouri Ozarks in the spring of 1986, watched a bank call her ground dry and a neighbor call the water his, and how she proved them both only half right. Her farm sat on hill ground north of town, 34 acres of open rough pasture, 28 in cedar and brush, 18 on a rocky slope that had never held a plow, and 12 acres of lower hayfield along the creek bottom. No pond anywhere on it, no drilled well. The barn roof had gone soft on the north side 2 winters back, and she hadn't found the money to fix it yet. She had run cattle on that ground since her father passed it to her in 1981, small numbers, careful numbers, hauling water from a rented tank most dry summers and getting by on creek access the rest of the year. It had never been an easy operation. That spring, with the bank tightening collateral requirements across half the county, it stopped being a workable one. The neighbor on the north side, a man named Otis Farrow, had a spring that never quit deep, cold, feeding a stone trough his family had used since before Clara was born. Otis wasn't a hard man. He believed, the same way most people in that valley believed it, that the spring belonged to his side of the line, because his side of the line was where the water came out of the ground. "That water is not yours, Clara," he told her once, not unkindly, leaning on the same fence the bank had just drawn a hard line along. "It never has been. Word got around the way it does at a feed store counter. A man near the register said a farm without a well wasn't worth carrying cattle on at all. Somebody else said if that spring water belonged to Clara's place, somebody would have used it by now. An old rancher named Dale Pruitt, who'd run cattle in that county longer than most men had been alive, said it plainest. A fence is a fence, Clara. Bank's not wrong. She went home that week without an answer for any of them, and without a plan beyond the one bad option in front of her: sell down the herd, or find water she didn't currently have a legal claim to. Her father had kept a cedar chest in the spare room, full of tax receipts, old grazing notes, and a stack of deeds going back 3 generations, none of it organized, most of it never looked at since he'd filed it away. He used to tell her, back when she was young enough to think it was just a saying, water on a farm is not always where the fence says it is. She hadn't understood what he meant by it. She went looking in that chest mostly because she didn't know where else to look. It took her 2 evenings to work through the box. On the second night, folded inside a 1948 deed for the North 40, she found a sentence she had to read 3 times before she trusted it. Together with right of watering at the North Spring and passage for stock by the marked lane. She sat at the kitchen table a long while with that page in front of her. The water was not hidden in the ground. It was hidden in the sentence everybody had skipped. She didn't go tearing fence down the next morning. She drove to the county recorder's office instead and asked to see the full chain of title on the North 40, going back as far as they had it. It took the clerk most of a morning to pull the old books. The 1948 deed matched the language Clara had found in her father's copy, word for word. An older plat from 1931 showed a narrow lane running along the property line from the barn, lot up toward a spring marked simply Spring House near the fence corner, with a small notation beside it, stock watering, shared use. Nobody had carried the notation forward past the 1950s. Deeds got rewritten, boundaries got resurveyed for tax purposes, and somewhere in 40 years of paperwork, a right that had once mattered a great deal to somebody had stopped mattering to anybody at all. It hadn't been erased. It had only stopped being read. Clara made copies of everything the recorder had, and then she went looking for what was left of it on the ground. The old lane was there, or what remained of it, a shallow, grown-over track running along the fence, choked with cedar and multiflora, rose thick enough in places that she had to work through it with loppers just to see the ground underneath. Near the fence corner, half buried in leaf litter, she found 2 squared stones set upright, spaced too evenly to be anything but markers. A rusted gate hinge, bolted to a post that had gone gray with age, hung loose on the Farrow side of the fence, unopened long enough that the hinge pin had frozen solid with rust. "That gate hasn't opened in 30 years, Otis told her, when she asked him about it over the fence a few days later. "That doesn't mean it was never a gate," Clara said. He didn't have an answer for that. Downhill from the spring itself, on his side of the line, stood a low stone foundation, mostly collapsed, that had clearly held some kind of structure, once a spring house, most likely the same one marked on the 1931 plat. A stone trough sat below it, still catching a thin, steady run of water that disappeared into overgrown grass before it reached anywhere useful. Clara stood there a long moment, looking at water that had been running the same direction for longer than either of their families had owned the ground on either side of it. She spent close to $1,300 that spring on something she did not yet have a guaranteed right to use. A retired surveyor named Hollis Tate charged her $420 to walk the boundary and confirm the old lane matched the 1931 description. The recorder's office charged $38 for certified copies. She bought chain and gate hardware for $96, paid a young man from down the road $180 to spend a day clearing cedar and brush off the lane, picked up a used stock tank for $275, and ran a length of poly pipe and fittings from the trough site down toward where a temporary tank could sit, for another $310. At the feed store, somebody said Clara Voss had gone and spent good money proving a spring she didn't own. Dale Pruitt shook his head over his coffee and said a disputed right wasn't water, not in any way a bank would count it. He turned out to be closer to right than Clara wanted, at least for a while. The county recorder's book was missing a page from the middle of the 1948 transaction. Nothing sinister, just an old filing error that had gone uncorrected for decades. And without it, the exact terms of the right-of-way were harder to pin down than Clara had hoped. Hollis Tate couldn't say with full confidence that both marker stones dated to the original survey. One of them, he thought, might have been reset sometime later, though he couldn't say when or why. Otis Farrow, once he understood what Clara was trying to establish, closed the old gate with a padlock and told her he wasn't opening it until a lawyer looked at the deed himself. And when Clara finally cleared enough brush to reach the trough and see what she actually had, the water coming off the spring was barely a thread, a pencil-thin stream, choked by years of leaves and silt built up in the old stone channel. "That won't water a milk cow," Otis said, watching her crouch by the trough one afternoon, let alone a herd. Clara didn't argue with him. She set a bucket under the flow and checked her watch. Roy Delacroix, when she brought the deed copies into the bank that week, looked them over carefully enough, but shook his head at the end of it. "A disputed right is not water, Clara," he said. "I need something the county will stand behind, and right now I've got an old deed, a missing page, and a locked gate." She went home with the folder still in her hand, and no better standing than when she'd walked in with it. What the deed had actually given her, she understood by then, was never ownership of the spring itself, Otis's family still owned the ground the water rose out of. What the old language gave her farm was narrower and older than that, a right to bring cattle up a specific lane, to water them at that specific trough, without disturbing the fence anywhere else, without claiming the spring for herself, without taking more than her herd needed to drink. She was not taking her neighbor's water. She was proving the farm had never lost the right to use it. That distinction mattered more than she expected. It was the difference between a claim and a trespass, and out in that valley, people did not forgive the second one easily, no matter how old the paper behind it was. Clara understood that if she pushed the lane wrong, or let cattle wander off it onto Otis's ground even once, the goodwill she needed from him would go the same direction the water had already gone underground and out of reach. She went back to the recorder's office and asked them to search the surrounding books for the missing page. It turned up eventually, filed a few pages out of sequence in the wrong ledger, exactly where a tired clerk might have set it down 40 years earlier and never gone back for it. It matched the language in her father's copy, clause for clause. Hollis Tate walked the lane a second time with the corrected description in hand and confirmed both marker stones sat within a few feet of where the 1931 survey placed them. Otis read the corrected copy at his own kitchen table, slowly, twice. "My father always said there used to be a lane through here," he said finally when Clara came by to talk it over. "I never asked him why he never used it." "Why do you think nobody did?" Clara asked. "People quit reading deeds," Otis said. "Once pumps got cheap enough that nobody needed an old spring anymore." He didn't fight her on it after that. He wasn't happy about cattle crossing near his fence line, and he said so plainly, but he unlocked the gate and told her he expected her to keep her animals to the lane and off the rest of his ground, and Clara told him that was exactly the arrangement she intended to keep. She fenced both sides of the old lane so cattle couldn't wander off it. She laid gravel around the trough to keep hooves from churning the ground to mud, fitted a float valve to keep the tank from overflowing and wasting what little flow there was, and set up a simple rotation so the herd came up to water on a schedule instead of camping at the spring all day. She kept a notebook, gallons estimated, days, head count, the same plain habit her father had kept for pasture notes his whole life. Once the trough and channel were cleared of leaf silt and running clean, the flow settled into something steadier than that first thin trickle had suggested. A bucket test at the cleared outlet came in close to 1.8 gallons a minute, held steady across 3 separate mornings. Not a strong flow, but a constant one, enough over a full day to fill a trough and hold it, provided nobody asked more of it than a controlled herd actually needed. August came in dry that year, the kind of dry that showed first in the neighboring ponds. Dale Pruitt's stock pond dropped low enough by the 3rd week that he had a water truck running most mornings, hauling loads out of town at $46 a run. A couple of the shallower wells around the valley started pulling air on the hottest afternoons, and the feed store sold out of stock tanks twice that month, ordering more each time from a supplier in Springfield. Clara's ground still had no pond, still no well of her own. But every morning that August, her cattle walked the cleared lane along the fence line to the North Spring, drank from the stone trough her father's deed had given her the right to use, and walked back down to graze. She never had to haul a load that summer. The one time she considered it, in the last week of July, the trough had refilled enough by the following morning that she left the truck in the barn lot and let the spring do what it had always done. Clara's ground still had no pond, still no well of her own, but every morning that August, her cattle walked the cleared lane along the fence line to the North Spring, drank from the stone trough her father's deed had given her the right to use, and walked back down to graze. Otis stood at his side of the fence one of those mornings and watched the herd move up the lane in a loose, unhurried line, the way animals move along a path they've already learned. "They remember a path fast," he said. "The deed remembered it first," Clara answered. She brought the full folder back to the bank in September, the corrected deed copy, the recorder's stamp, Hollis Tate's survey sketch, photographs of both marker stones, the bucket flow readings from 3 separate mornings, and 3 months of usage records showing exactly how much water her herd had drawn and when. Roy went through it page by page, slower than he needed to, the way a man goes through paperwork he wants to be sure of before he changes his mind about something. When he finished, he crossed out the old line on the appraisal sheet, no independent water source, and wrote above it, in plain block letters, deeded spring access, north boundary. It's still not a well, he said. No, Clara said. He looked at the flow log once more before he closed the folder. But it's water. The new appraisal carried the 92 acres at $315 an acre instead of the $165 it had been listed at that spring, a swing in collateral value of just under $14,000, enough to move her renewal off the ledge it had been sitting on since April. It wasn't a fortune. It didn't clear her note or buy her a new roof for the barn. What it did was let her keep the herd she had, keep the note she had, and go into the next dry summer with water she didn't have to fight for anymore. The bank had not lied that spring. There was no well on Clara's side of the fence, and there never had been. The county's tax map hadn't lied either. It had simply stopped reading past the boundary line, the way most modern paperwork does. But some farms carry older instructions than the ones written on a current plat, from a time when water mattered enough that men wrote it into a deed and expected their children to remember why. For 30-some years, the spring on the north line had kept running the same direction it always had. And for all those years, one line in an old deed had kept the right to reach it, waiting on somebody to open the book and read it. Otis saw his spring. The bank saw no well. The county saw a dry, ordinary parcel with a fence running through the middle of it. Clara saw one sentence, folded into a deed nobody had looked at in decades. And that August, while ponds dropped low across the rest of the valley, that sentence watered her cattle. Would you trust the fence line? Or would you go back and read the deed before you called a farm dry?